Frank Beard was one of those rock stars whose public image was almost impossible to separate from the joke at the center of it. He was the drummer of ZZ Top, the band famous for two enormous beards, yet Frank himself was famously the clean-shaven one. But behind the sunglasses, humor, and Texas rock swagger was a much more complicated personal story. Frank Beard died on August 17, 2026, at age 77, at his ranch in Richmond, Texas, while receiving hospice care and surrounded by family. And now that people are looking back at his life, his relationships deserve attention, not because Frank Beard had some endless celebrity dating history, but almost the opposite. His romantic life was surprisingly private. His first major marriage was to Catherine Alexander. The two married on April 12, 1978, when Beard was approaching the height of ZZ Top's rise. Their marriage lasted a little over 3 years before ending in divorce in July 1981. There isn't a huge amount of reliable public information about why the marriage ended, and that's important. It is tempting, especially when telling a rock star story, to fill those gaps with speculation. But Frank Beard's life doesn't need invented drama. The reality was already complicated enough. The late 1970s were an extraordinary period for ZZ Top, and an extremely difficult period for Beard personally. The band's success was growing rapidly, and with success came money, freedom, and access to a lifestyle that Beard later admitted he struggled to control. He eventually spoke openly about his addiction problems during that era. By his own account, after the band became successful, he had the money to support a destructive lifestyle, and he later regarded that period as one of his biggest regrets. That's one of the most revealing parts of Beard's story. From the outside, a rock musician receiving a huge paycheck might look like he had finally made it. But Beard's experience showed the darker side of that success. He later entered rehabilitation and worked toward sobriety. ZZ Top also took an extended break while he dealt with his problems. In my view, this is where his story becomes more interesting than the usual rock and roll mythology. It would be easy to portray the 1970s as one long party and make Beard's struggles sound glamorous. They weren't. He eventually acknowledged that the lifestyle had consequences, including damage to relationships and his own sense of stability. His decision to seek help was arguably more significant than anything he bought or achieved during those years. Then came an important turning point. In November 1982, Beard married Debbie Meredith. The timing is striking. His first marriage had ended the previous year, and he had also gone through a serious period of personal turmoil. Yet this second marriage became the lasting relationship of his life. Beard and Meredith had 3 children together, including twin sons, and remained married for decades. That longevity says something. Frank Beard spent more than half a century in one of the most recognizable rock bands on the planet. He experienced touring, enormous success, changing music trends, television exposure, and the pressures that come with being famous. Yet his second marriage largely stayed out of the celebrity spotlight. And perhaps that's exactly what Beard wanted. Unlike many rock stars whose romantic lives became part of their entertainment value, Beard didn't turn his family into a public spectacle. There were no endless headlines about celebrity girlfriends and dramatic breakups. His personal life was considerably quieter than his professional life. That makes Debbie Meredith particularly important to the story. She wasn't simply the woman Beard married after his first marriage ended. She became his partner through the decades that followed, including the years when ZZ Top went from successful blues rock act to international institution. Beard's career was also unusually stable. He joined ZZ Top in 1969 and remained at the center of the band for more than 5 decades. He played alongside Billy Gibbons and Dusty Hill through the band's transformation from a Texas blues rock group into one of the biggest acts of the MTV era. That kind of longevity is remarkable on its own. But it becomes even more impressive when you remember what Beard had to overcome personally. The public saw the sunglasses, the jokes, and the rhythm section behind songs like La Grange, Tush, and Sharp-Dressed Man. What they didn't necessarily see was a man who had already learned that fame and money couldn't solve personal problems. His recovery didn't erase his past. It gave him a chance to build something different. And that's probably the fairest way to look at his relationship history. Frank Beard wasn't a perfect rock star husband whose life followed some Hollywood fairy tale. He had a first marriage that ended, serious personal struggles, and a period when his lifestyle spiraled badly. But he also appears to have learned from those experiences. His marriage to Debbie Meredith lasted more than 4 decades. That's a remarkable contrast with the stereotype of the endlessly touring rock musician. Even in his final years, family remained close. Beard died at his Texas ranch surrounded by family, according to reports. There is something quietly fitting about that. Frank Beard spent his professional life behind a drum kit, helping define the sound of ZZ Top while Billy Gibbons and Dusty Hill occupied much of the visual spotlight. Yet when his story ended, it wasn't the stage that mattered most. It was home. And perhaps that is the part of Frank Beard's story worth remembering. His legacy isn't simply that he was the drummer who wasn't really wearing the beard. It isn't just the millions of records, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction, or the decades of touring. It's also the fact that his life contained mistakes, consequences, recovery, and eventually stability. His first marriage didn't last. His second marriage did. His early success brought excess. His later years brought perspective. And while fans will remember the unmistakable ZZ Top sound, those who knew Beard personally will remember something much more human, a musician who lived through some very difficult chapters, changed direction, built a family, and ultimately remained part of the same band for more than 50 years. That's a far more interesting story than the caricature of the rock star. Frank Beard didn't have a perfect life, but he had a long one, and by the end of it, he had something many people who become famous never managed to keep, a family life that remained largely his own. If you want more breaking news, untold stories, and the latest updates from the world of rock and roll, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We'll keep you updated on the legends, the music, and the stories making headlines. Subscribe now and stay connected to the world of rock and roll.